I spent my actual real hard-earned money. I imported this book so that I could have a physical copy, and I read it, and I've lived to tell the tale. I want you to imagine this. You are an author. Your publisher commissions you to write a few sequels to a classic novel that is long, long past the expiration of its copyright. This novel is quite famous, nearly 150 years after its initial publication, and public interest in it is still soaring. Just a few years prior, the novel had been adapted into a musical, which was then translated from its original French into English. It is now experiencing international acclaim and notoriety. In your home country, a brand new miniseries is being based on the same novel and is going to be released very soon, and it seems like it'll potentially be a hit. Other authors in other countries have already released unofficial sequels in other languages. It seems that there would be no problem taking your publisher's commission and publishing several sequels of your own. You get to work. You finish your manuscript, and it's ready for publication. Your publisher has already announced the second sequel's title to the public. It's great. Everything's great. And then you hear from the original author's great-great-grandson. You see, he's read the book, and he thinks it's fucking garbage. He thinks it's so bad that your book could potentially destroy his ancestors' entire legacy. And he's suing you over this. Now, you have to defend your work that you published just for a paycheck. And the decision that the court makes will potentially have a permanent impact in how moral rights are defined and applied in your country. This happened to my good friend François Cérésa. Hi, my name is Taylor. I like Les Mis a little bit too much. I'm joined with a guest today. This is Zai. He wants to assist me in this video essay. First, some housekeeping. If you don't know much about Les Mis and you want to know what happens in the book, I recommend you watch my previous video in which I describe Les Mis for like 40 minutes straight. Or you can read the book, I guess. I don't speak French, so you're going to hear me pronounce a lot of French words, phrases, and names using my intense Anglophone accent, and we're all going to be really cool and really normal about it. For the structure of this video, I'm going to first talk about the lawsuit surrounding the book before I summarize the book and discuss my thoughts on it, because this is how I chose to approach the book, and I don't want your understanding of the lawsuit to be clouded by my opinions on the book itself. Speaking of the lawsuit and my lack of French fluency, I did struggle to find a lot of information about the lawsuit, and I think it's for a few reasons. First is that I spent a lot of time looking for English language resources, and finding those lacking, I did turn to some French language resources, and because my French isn't great, and I certainly don't understand legal French, I imagine I am missing a lot of nuances and details. I also think that the age of this lawsuit is a problem when it comes to finding information about it. This took place in the early 2000s, and while that means there are online news articles about it, the information we have is spotty. I ran into a lot of broken links while trying to follow citations, and there's only so much information that can be gleaned from opinion pieces and vague interest pieces, and only so much information that can be gleaned from publicly posted court statements. So this will be more of an introduction to the case rather than a complete look at it. Listen, I tried. I found quite a lot of sources. I found quite a lot of news articles from the time period, court documents, etc., etc., etc. I think it was according to Pew Research that a solid 38% of web pages from prior to 2013 no longer exist. Digital decay is a thing, and I am constantly contending with it. Let's say you want to read this book. You do not have to purchase a copy like I did. I wanted a physical copy. I thought it would be a better reading experience for me. But you don't have to buy it. You can borrow an ebook copy of the English translation from the Internet Archive. I have it linked in the description. I also have the book and its sequel. Yes, this book has its own sequel, linked in French down below, also on the Internet Archive. Finally, I've also linked the 1995 Laura Kalpakian Cosette sequel, which is also on the Internet Archive. Long live the Internet Archive. François Cérésa was born June 26, 1953 in Cannes, France. He is an author and a literary journalist. He's written a number of novels in addition to having a long career in newspaper writing. He's also published food criticism under the pseudonym Jules Margaret. He, throughout his life, has worked closely with Plon. Plon is a publishing house founded in 1852. Plon was founded by Henri Plon after a series of publishing house creations and mergers during the 1830s up until the 1850s. This journey began in 1833 when Maximilien Bethune, a printer, T. Benin, and Henri Plon formed the company Bethune, Benin et Plon, which was renamed Bethune et Plon in 1835. What happened to the other guy? I don't know. This became a very successful printing house that was visited by Victor Hugo, Honoré de Balzac, Alphonse de Lamartine, Alexandre Dumas. Yes, ironically, Victor Hugo did publish occasionally under Bethune et Plon. Side note, this was a little bit hard to confirm because Hugo published so much stuff and under so many different publishers, but I did eventually find a first edition of the Baclave on an auction site and was definitely published by Bethune et Plon. Anyways, François Cérésa has worked with Plon for many years, both before and after the publication of Cosette. According to a few sources that I read, Plon commissioned Cérésa to write Cosette or The Time of Illusions and its sequel Marius or The Fugitive. Now, I think that this is interesting because that says to me that this wasn't necessarily a passion project from a huge Les Mis fan, but rather like a fanfiction commission, probably for the paycheck or the notoriety. Olivier Aubin, the head of Plon at the time, according to an article by Le Figaro, decided to put on a competition between several Plon authors to create a Les Mis sequel just in time for the bicentennial of Victor Hugo's birth in 1802. From this competition, Aubin selected François Cérésa's manuscript. Why would Plon commission an author to write a sequel to Les Miserables? We're looking at the late 1990s and early 2000s in France here.
Who is this man? What sort of devil is he? To have me caught in a trap and choose to let me go free. It was his hour at last to put a seal on my fate.
Reasonably, and I don't pretend to have insight into the brains of the brightest minds at Plon at the time, given that I can't fucking find much information, so I am simply making assumptions based on what I know from that time period. One could assume that a Les Mis unofficial sequel could do well in a French market. Hell, the Kalpakian books seem to do alright enough over in the United States, and Les Mis does not nearly have the same cultural standing it does over there than it does in France. Plus, an upcoming miniseries means that some people might be interested in consuming more Les Mis. It's a weird move, sure, but it's a move that'll probably result in some profit for Plon and Cérésa. Of course, this is assuming the book isn't Pierre Hugo's final straw. Now, why this book and not any other Les Mis adaptation? Why was this the one that was singled out? I don't really know. Once again, I don't know what the Hugo family was thinking at this time, truly, but I do know that moral rights are firm and strict in France with historical precedents, and French adaptations pre-2000 weren't necessarily bad enough to elicit a lawsuit reasonably, and suing international adaptations and sequels opens up a legal can of worms that is likely far beyond what the family was prepared to do. Now, I once again want to bring up the Laura Kalpakian Cosette book from 1995, which I believe is the first attempted Les Mis sequel, and is definitely more infamous amongst Anglophone Les Mis fans. From Goodreads. Millions have shared the unforgettable story of the waif Cosette, adopted daughter of Jean Valjean and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables. Now, the tale of Cosette continues in this sweeping, exhilarating epic that interweaves its own galaxy of characters and narrative with real events and historical figures. From dingy artist cafes to brilliantly gaslit Parisian boulevards, from shadowy prisons to balls at the presidential palace, author Laura Kalpakian has crafted an epic reminiscent of Hugo's original but fueled by its own creative combustion. I have not read this sequel yet.
I have not read this sequel yet. I have not read this sequel yet.
Guys, I can't fucking believe this, but apparently I've read this book before. I was searching for like a Goodreads review or something that mentioned that this is a nipple line, which is very infamous. Zai's back. And what came up was a Tumblr post on Google. The thing is, I made the fucking Tumblr post. The Tumblr post came from a Les Mis side blog that I ran. I'm like crying. That I ran briefly in like 2015 or so. I remembered my URL. I did delete the blog, but this post that I made lives on because someone was reblogging it and adding information to it. So all of my content is in here. And the post is a lengthy review of all of the parts about this book that I hated. I'm going to put screenshots of my post in the video. I have this is my official review of Cosette by Laura Kalpakian, which I apparently read. I do not remember a single thing about it, except for this is a nipple. It's a book I read. According to the post, the post shows a photograph I posted of the physical book with the "this is the nipple" part. It's like I had a physical copy that I was taking pictures of. I'm reading my descriptions, and it looks like the Laura Kalpakian book is a fucking disaster. Azelma is there, and she's the main antagonist. There's a lot of stuff having to do with she apparently has sex with Louis Napoleon himself and has a baby with him who she names Eponine II, and then she does this crazy plot to get Eponine to marry Marius and Cosette's kid, a son who apparently, I wrote down he's terrible and has no redeeming qualities, and apparently she wants Eponine to marry this Pontmercy child as some kind of like lost destiny stuff because she thinks that her sister Eponine should have married Marius. It's also somehow revenge. I don't really know how it's a revenge plot. I don't remember. I went out of my way to highlight that there's a sex scene that takes place inside of a hoop skirt. Now, this must have scandalized me, given the content, but I'm reading that now being like, that's whatever, sure, whatever. What I'm concerned about is that at the beginning, you see the 1832 rebellion. I note that Enjolras scrambles to the top of the barricade and just screams, "Shit!" Insanely funny. I note that the author spends most of her time talking about Combeferre, which, like, yeah, same. And I also note that she made up some OCs in the barricade section so that there could be some barricade survivors for Marius and Cosette to interact with later in the book. I want you to hold on to this, put a pin in this, because Cérésa does the exact same thing. I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind right now. There is a line that I have quoted. I don't attribute it to anyone. I don't know the context behind it, but it says, "You will hang by your cock in hell." One more crime. It's the very first thing I noted, actually, is that Javert in the book says, "Republican scum like you cannot overthrow the King of France. One day more, and you'll piss blood. I'll meet you in hell." So Laura really seems to really like the musical, because half of that's just the musical. He wouldn't say that. I cannot believe I deleted my Les Mis Tumblr account I shouldn't have done that. I deleted all of my old Tumblr accounts. I had one since like 2009 or something crazy like that. I wonder what else is there. Because I didn't remember that I was making my own original posts. What? I do think that this is the earliest attempt at a sequel. Previous book adaptations such as Gavroche and Jean Valjean were condensed retellings of the story. I'm so sorry, I just hit my cat in the process of that. He deals with so much. Anyways, these were condensed retellings of the stories, not necessarily sequels. One may argue that this is worse than attempting to write a sequel, but I digress. This, Cosette by Laura Kalpakian, was published in the United States, not in France. Had this been published in France, I dare say it would have been a bigger problem than it was. Other works by Victor Hugo had also been adapted in various forms by this time, not just Les Mis. Notably, the Hunchback of Notre Dame Disney movie had just come out in 1996, and it could probably be argued that this is an adaptation that really, really fails to retain the integrity of the original story. But then again, this would require the Hugo descendants to go toe-to-toe with Disney, which is not only a monstrously large company that is infamously difficult to sue, but is also centered in the United States, which has a very different take on moral rights than France does. In France, copyright expires 70 years after the death of the last surviving co-author of a work. Les Mis entered public domain in 1936, 70 years after the death of Victor Hugo. Moral rights are different. Moral rights is the term used to describe rights for an author to retain the right of attribution, using their name, pseudonym, or the choice to be anonymous, and the right to integrity of their work. The first section of this definition is fairly straightforward. This refers to authors retaining the right to have their original work labeled as being authored by them far after the copyright ends. For example, Bram Stoker's Dracula is attributed to him beyond the expiration of the copyright. It would not be considered okay for a publisher to publish the Dracula manuscript under a different author's name. The integrity section is a little bit more vague, and that's where the issue of the Cosette sequel is. France, alongside Germany, were the first countries to recognize these rights, before moral rights were included in the Berne Convention for the Protection of Literary and Artistic Works in 1928. Through the Rome revision of the Berne Convention in 1928, the Berne Convention accepted two forms of moral rights, paternity and integrity. These rights are included in Article 6 bis of the Berne Convention as follows. Independent of the author's economic rights, and even after the transfer of said rights, the author shall have the right to claim authorship of the work and to object to any distortion, modification of, or other derogatory action. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because one of my other cats is sniffing my camera. Do you not like when I talk about moral rights? Other derogatory action in relation to the said work, which would be prejudicial to the author's honor or reputation. Not all countries recognize these rights, and even countries that signed to the Berne Convention simply signed to agree to these principles. There isn't an international body that forcefully enforces moral rights. Each signatory has to handle their jurisdiction on their own. There's even an example of a Berne Convention signatory country that signed an additional act stating that they were excluding themselves from the moral rights portion of the convention. That country? The United States of America. Moral rights in France are perpetual, inalienable, and imprescriptible, making them untransferable and unrenounceable, even after the author's death. When the author of a work dies, the moral rights are transferred to their heirs, regardless of where the economic rights of the work have been transferred to. In 2001, descendants of Victor Hugo initiated a lawsuit against Plon, the publisher of Cérésa's Cosette or the Time of Illusions and Marius or the Fugitive. According to a CNN article from the time, the descendants were seeking a large amount of money. I'm not using a specific number here because everything I read had a different number listed. But they were requesting this money in damages from publishing house Plon. The claim, condensed into one line, was primarily that the book, Cosette or the Time of Illusions, violated moral rights by betraying the spirit of the original book. If I may translate this a bit, they were saying that it was shit and missed the point of Les Mis. In fact, Victor Hugo's great-great-grandson, Pierre, who is the main spokesperson representing the descendants in this case, and is frankly the only descendant I saw mentioned at all, and when I refer to Pierre and the descendants for the rest of the video, note that I am using them almost interchangeably. He is quoted as saying, "The characters have been kidnapped. Authors should have a little imagination and do something different." The descendants, or Pierre, were also quoted as claiming the misuse of a work of our cultural heritage for commercial purposes should be barred or abandoned in any intelligent human community that is concerned about protecting and enriching its culture. They also sent letters to French President Jacques Chirac, French ministers of culture and education, and members of European Parliament, urging them to condemn the misuse of literary classics. According to Le Figaro, Pierre Hugo's lawyer, Stéphane Loisy, said not only did Plon fail to consult Mr. Hugo, but the publisher subsequently treated him offhandedly and refused any discussion. Most of all, Mr. Cérésa's works completely twist the original. The challenge was supported by the Société des gens de lettres, an authors' rights group set up in 1838 by Victor Hugo and peers like Honoré de Balzac and Alexandre Dumas, which is incredibly funny if you think about it. And not to spoil you on the book, but these names are going to come up again.
Who is this man? What sort of devil is he to have me caught in a trap and choose to let...
There are some notable issues with this book that descendants took particular offense to, according to news articles from the time. You see, despite being marketed as a sequel to Les Mis, the book completely disregards several key moments in the ending of the original. Most crucial, in my opinion, as it is something that gets brought up again and again in news articles from that time period as an important aspect of this lawsuit, and this is a spoiler for the summary aspect of the video, which I promise I will get to. But this is so egregious that I think I need to warn you before I even summarize the book, is that Cérésa keeps Javert alive, when in the original story he drowns himself near the end of the book. This is an important culmination of his character arc, and ignoring that means ignoring the character himself. Pierre Hugo claimed that his great-great-grandfather was particularly proud of this ending, and retconning this specifically is offensive to Hugo's memory. On September 3rd, 1843, Victor Hugo's daughter Léopoldine drowned in the Seine River alongside her husband when their boat overturned. Her husband Charles attempted to rescue her, but her heavy clothing dragged her downwards. Léopoldine was only 19 years old when she died. Charles also died during this incident. Hugo, at the time, was traveling and not easily contactable. He learned about his daughter's death in a newspaper. Several days later, he wrote in a letter, "Yesterday I had just come from a long walk in the sun through the marshes. I was weary, I was thirsty. I arrived at a village named, I believe, Soubise, and entered a café. They brought me a beer and a newspaper, Le Siècle. I read. Thus, I learned that the better half of my life and my heart was dead." Hugo had begun writing Les Mis a year prior, and after Léopoldine's death, entered a difficult period of his life. He wouldn't finish Les Mis for many, many years. In the meantime, he wrote several books of poetry, some of the most famous being dedicated to Léopoldine. This is an event that altered his life permanently, and echoes through his body of work for the rest of his life. In Les Mis, two specific characters learn about drownings through newspapers. Javert reads about Jean Valjean's death after Jean Valjean returns to prison and falls from a ship he's doing labor on while rescuing a fellow prisoner. Although he didn't actually die, the death was faked. Javert spends a portion of the book assuming that Jean Valjean is truly dead until he sees him himself later on. Jean Valjean learns about Javert's successful suicide in a newspaper. This time, the death is real, although Cérésa disagrees, but we'll discuss that later. I think it's incredibly important that these two characters, foils of each other and partially based on the same person, learn about each other drowning through newspapers, given Hugo's personal experience with this. They are both narratively important and emotionally important to the author.
Who is this man? What sort of devil is he?
One other thing I think I need to bring up here. I didn't really see this brought up much in articles from the time, nor is this a particularly important aspect of the book, but something else important, I think, is that Cérésa makes Victor Hugo a character within the book. He isn't really there. He's more like brought up by a character, but still. He's there in that he is in Paris having sex with his mistress, and Marius and Cosette are aware of him. Like, not only does Cérésa attempt to tack on a sequel to an existing author's work, but Cérésa plonks said existing author into the sequel like an Easter egg. He also does this with other authors from the time period, as well as political figures, etc. I'll discuss other issues with the book when I summarize it. For now, just remember that Javert's role in the book is a huge issue in this lawsuit. On the other side of this lawsuit, publisher Plon argued Cosette or the Time of Illusions was written as a tribute to Hugo's classic, not as an attempt to disgrace its memory. Their lawyers also said that Hugo did not trust his family to manage his legacy, having once described his grandchildren as simpletons. This, I think, is a hilariously insane argument to make. I mean, imagine decades-old family beef being dragged up just to try to demean your argument in court. Other arguments used in this case included protecting the freedom of expression and that preventing authors from adapting stories in public domain would negatively impact authors, art itself, etc. On March 31st, 2004, the Paris Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Hugo's descendants and ordered the Plon publishing house to pay them a symbolic €1 in damages. The court ruled that no continuation could be given to a work such as Les Mis without infringing on the moral rights of Victor Hugo. Okay. So, Hugo's descendants, Pierre Hugo, won. It's over. No sequel. But this was not the end of the case. You see, Plon kept pushing, and the case left the Paris Court of Appeals and went to the Court of Cassation, France's highest court, where the case was continued until January 30th, 2007. The Court of Cassation's decision ultimately differed from the Paris Court of Appeals. The ruling was that a sequel to Victor Hugo's novel Les Mis could not be prohibited if this sequel, although contested by the writer's heirs, respected the name of the original author and the integrity of his work, which had fallen into the public domain. The arguments made by the Court of Appeals and their decision were described as ineffective by the Court of Cassation, which emphasized that the appeals court was not required to judge the merit of the work or its completeness, but rather to determine whether the contested works had altered Victor Hugo's work or given rise to confusion over authorship. In short, the Court of Cassation argued that the Court of Appeals did not properly consider the case in terms of moral rights, but rather looked at whether they thought the Cérésa sequels were, worthy or good of being attached to Les Mis as an adaptation. Part of this ruling was that as Victor Hugo had not wanted his descendants to have control over his work, which was to pass into public domain after his death, Pierre had no legal or moral right to challenge the publication of Cérésa's novel. Once again, sick burns to the Hugo family. Part of the argument was that the Hugo descendants had not properly proved during the case that they held moral rights over Hugo's works. Funnily, in 2007, Pierre Hugo would publish a book titled Les Hugo...
Oh no, okay.
Témoignage.
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 Témoignage. Oh my god.
A genealogy and family history of the Hugo family. In 2008, Plon's lawyers told Reuters News, the court has dismissed the suit of the descendants of Victor Hugo in order to pay them €10,000 in damages and interest. Pierre Hugo responded to this decision pretty immediately, according to a Guardian article from the time. He said, I believed we were fighting the good cause, but the court decided otherwise. It is very, very disappointing. I am not just fighting for myself, my family, and for Victor Hugo, but for the descendants of all writers, painters, and composers who should be protected from people who want to use a famous name and work just for money. Mr. Pierre Hugo said, I don't mind adaptations, and many are very good, but this book is not an adaptation. I have read it, and it is not badly written, but the publishers used Victor Hugo's name and the title Les Misérables as commercial operation. It was nothing to do with literature, and they were just trying to make money. The Guardian continued, Mr. Cérésa's lawyers argue that banning this novel would violate freedom of expression and prevent others from using great works of art and literature as inspiration. Victor Hugo himself once wrote, as a writer, has but one heir, the public domain. This is brought up several times in different articles that I read. Hugo intended for Les Mis to enter the public domain. He had no intentions to retain strong copyright control over his works through his heirs. His opinions towards writing and copyright, in conjunction with his well-known disdain for his descendants, seemingly came together to bite Pierre in the ass a bit. Had Victor Hugo been deeply interested in his heirs controlling the moral rights of his works, maybe the case would have gone differently. As it stands, well, Les Mis was always destined to the public, and apparently Pierre had not proven solidly enough that, despite all of this, he still had the rights to this. This final decision cleared the way for Plon and Cérésa to continue selling Cosette or the Time of Illusions and Marius or the Fugitive. This isn't new in, fanfiction and copyright and stuff like that. A 2001 CNN article I read about this court case makes reference to another sequel court battle. The 2001 lawsuit between the estate of Margaret Mitchell and Alice Randall for her retelling of the Civil War novel Gone with the Wind from the perspective of enslaved people. Authors and descendants suing other authors over publication of what is essentially fanfiction is not a new thing, and it is not contained just to this instance or even this time period. Here I am quoting a blog post made on the Rochester Institute of Technology reported by Bailey Gribben. Original content creators have always been divided on the idea of fanfiction. Some have even exercised their right as the content owner to sue fanfiction writers for copyright infringement on the basis that fanfiction does not follow fair use. A notable court case which made it up to the United States District Court was between a Swedish fanfiction author whose work featured a 76-year-old version of Holden Caulfield from J.D. Salinger's novel The Catcher in the Rye. The result of this case prevented the fanfiction from being published in the United States due to the fact that it was a direct parody of the original work. Another fanfiction court case, which had a completely opposite ruling, was between SunTrust and the Houghton Mifflin Company. It addressed the potential copyright infringement in Alice Randall's The Wind Done Gone, which is a fanfiction based on the literary classic Gone with the Wind. The judge in this case ruled that Randall's fanfiction did not breach any copyright laws. She found it to be a transformative piece because it provided social benefit by shedding light on an earlier work and in the process creating a new one. This case verified to both content creators as well as fanfiction writers that even reimagined work made by fans can have substantial social benefit. Keeping in mind that both of these cases are from the United States, where moral rights aren't protected in the same way they are with other Berne Convention signatory countries. Many authors, many of which being from the United States, such as Anne Rice, Annette Curtis Klause, Robin Hobb, George R. R. Martin, and Robin McKinley, have attempted to block fanfiction written based on the original works in hope of protecting the copyright and moral rights of their works. This is an ongoing issue in copyright made even more difficult to define when countries have different understandings of how moral rights should be enforced. At what point has an adaptation or a parody or even something sparked by inspiration overstepped moral rights and begun to negatively impact the integrity of the original work? And what do you do when things are being published in different countries where there are different legal protections for moral rights? In France, you may remember, moral rights cannot be waived. In Canada, where I am, authors and creators can waive their moral rights, and from what I've seen, moral rights aren't as intensely enforced as they are in France. But I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know. I'm kind of talking out of my ass. There is artistic merit in writing what is essentially fanfiction. So much important media today is based on previous things, and I'm not even referring to romance books clearly based on Raylo fanfiction. We've benefited time and time again from people being insane about specific pieces of media and creating new pieces of media based on their interests. Imagine if we couldn't have Nosferatu today, although the Stoker estate very much tried to stop Nosferatu, I should probably note that. The Korean pop industry would crumble if no one was allowed to blatantly base storylines on Demian by Hermann Hesse. Cosette, or The Time of Illusions, is a bit more intense because it was literally advertised as a sequel to Les Mis, not an adaptation, not a work just inspired by it, but literally a sequel. But there's examples of this too. Wide Sargasso Sea is a prequel to Jane Eyre. Samsa in Love is a spin-off of The Metamorphosis. This is a common practice. It's just that this one really caught the ire of a guy who positioned himself as the spokesperson for his ancestor and his fellow descendants. So I obtained a copy of the 2003 translation by Pan Macmillan. Once again, I could have read it online. I chose not to. Anyways, first things I want to note is that for the English translation that I have here, the title is just Cosette, the sequel to Les Miserables. It does not specify that the title is supposed to be Cosette or the Time of Illusions. It does say it on the inside cover, but not on the outside cover. I just find that to be an interesting decision. Anyways, this paperback chunker has 471 pages of content, no introduction, no notes, just throws you into the story, says good luck. Now, the back description reads, "From the salons to the streets, from the cafes to the stench of prison, Cosette is the sequel to Victor Hugo's classic Les Miserables. Continuing the story 2 months after the death of Jean Valjean, François Cérésa has written an exciting, intriguing, and convincing novel of France in the turbulent times of the July Monarchy. Valjean's daughter Cosette, now 18, has married her beloved Marius and is blissfully happy. But Cosette's newfound contentment is soon threatened by her husband's close association with Amédée, under whose influence he evolves from a loving husband into an uncaring adulterer. While Marius plunges deeper into the underworld of Paris, Cosette turns to the mysterious Verjat for solace. A plot hatched during Mardi Gras ultimately sees Marius deported to the penal colony Valjean had been condemned to years before. Cosette is distraught, believing her errant husband dead, but her friend Verjat, who bears an uncanny resemblance to Inspector Javert, embarks upon a quest for the truth and his own redemption. Characters, including Alexandre Dumas and Victor Hugo himself, crisscross and encounter each other anew in this powerfully atmospheric novel. An instant bestseller in Europe, Cosette brilliantly takes up the story where Hugo left it. Teeming with life, wit, and period detail, François Cérésa has written a novel that is not only appeals to the lovers of historical fiction, but also to fans of the popular stage musical. Immediate thoughts on this description. It's not actually accurate to the plot. I'll get to the actual plot in a moment. It definitely implies that Cosette is the main character of the book that we follow, and she isn't, unfortunately. I also want to highlight the last line about appealing to fans of the popular musical. Remember what I said earlier about this coming at a time when the musical is popping off in popularity internationally? Yeah. Dare I say Pierre had a point when he said this might be a cash grab? I'm a visual person, and I have no footage I can use for this section to make it make more sense. So what I'm going to do is talk about the book. I'm going to summarize the book, and I'm going to use the only blank surface in my home. The only blank surface I have in my cabinets. I am armed with every single sticky note that I had in the household. I did not have any left. I am armed with a pointer, and I am armed with a Sharpie. And hopefully I'll be able to create a visual guide. Cosette, or The Time of Illusions, opens 2 months after Marius and Cosette's wedding, and their marriage is already in shambles. I am electing to represent Cosette using the 2018 BBC version of her, and Marius, I'm using a photo of Nick Jonas. Ooh, my camera's over here. For Marius, I'm using this photo of Nick Jonas. Can I live when we are parted? So, they're married. It's been 2 months. Marriage isn't working out. Now, this isn't explicitly stated, but there's this sense that Marius is struggling to come to terms with his life post-barricade. He's witnessed a lot at this point, and on page 4, the narrator states that most of the potential guiding figures in Marius's life have died. Jean Valjean dies at the end of Les Mis, Courfeyrac is gone, Gillenormand and Théodule are both killed on page 4. Gillenormand, the grandfather, dies of natural causes, and Théodule is killed in Algeria. Marius in this state of mental disarray, and having come into a lot of money recently. If you remember, at the end of Les Mis, he comes into quite a lot of money. He's interested in some lifestyle changes. Now, Marius decides that they need to move out of the Gillenormand household, mainly out of distaste for his aunt. And in a weird attempt to rekindle the love in his marriage, he purchases the house at Rue Plumet as a surprise for Cosette. They move in, or I guess Cosette moves back in and Marius moves in for the first time. Almost immediately, the pair are at odds again, due to the stark difference in their tastes. Marius, intent on solidifying his status as a wealthy baron, insists on purchasing a lot of ostentatious furniture, whereas Cosette, who is still reeling from the death of Jean Valjean, is having a kind of Christian self-flagellation moment and is leaning more into kinds of toned down aesthetics and thriftier habits. They have a lot of arguments about this, Marius kind of going overboard with bathing himself in his own wealth, a huge slingshot in lifestyle after living several years in poverty on purpose. And Cosette is kind of like, I don't know, maybe we don't need to prove our wealth to these randos that we don't even know. And Marius is like, God, you are such a fucking child! Shut the fuck up! He also blames her for a lot of negative things in his life, such as his legal career going not so well, which, I don't know, it's odd. Anyways, Marius is not doing well mentally, and Cosette is not sure what to do about it. Now, Marius, at this point, has a friend. You're not gonna believe it. He was at the barricade. His name is Frédéric. He works in a newspaper publishing industry and is a relatively staunch Republican. The pair meet at Gillenormand's funeral, of all places, as Frédéric apparently saw the obituary in the newspaper and recognized Marius's name and wanted to catch up with him. Frédéric as a character is pretty stable and seems quite concerned about the path that Marius is going down. Marius, for what it's worth, seems to be fully a Republican in this book, mentally referring to himself as one at times, weathering several mentions about Napoleon without even hinting that he might have intense feelings about those topics, or at one point having intense feelings about the topic. I note this because it's a bit of a steep change from the first book. Even in his most Republican moments, the mention of Napoleon still stirs him up a little bit. Here, at least for a little while, Marius seems pretty firm in his self-identification as a Republican radical. He's just not really willing to walk the walk anymore post-barricade. Marius and Cosette begin going out a little bit more to opera performances, briefly meeting Lafayette and Thiers for no fucking reason besides to shoehorn them in, I guess. Here, Marius and Cosette meet Amédée. So Amédée was heckling a performance at the opera. Marius is enamored with Amédée's energy, while Cosette finds him annoying. Marius at this point in time has been thinking a lot about how he prefers instant gratification over anything else and no longer wants to fight for a better future or fight to receive pleasures. He just wants to party. Amédée, to him, represents the style that he wants. So Marius is keen on attaching himself to Amédée. This is what he wants. But, unfortunately for Marius, Amédée is way more interested in Cosette carnally. Anyways, I'm sorry. Amédée sticking to Cosette, it's lore accurate. Amédée and Marius begin to spend a lot more time together. For Amédée, this is with the intention to get into Cosette's pants. And Marius is introduced to Amédée's social circle. Marius begins to spend most of his nights away from Cosette, spending his cash money, drinking, partying it up, and he begins an affair with Amédée's ex. Her name is Clémence, by the way. By page 32, Marius and Frédéric essentially have a friend breakup about all of this. So we're moving him over here. Cosette, meanwhile, is turning further inward to herself and focusing on gardening, sewing, and doing some work at the local church. Around page 60-ish, Marius begins to regret some of his choices a bit. He meets Raphael, who I forgot to make a sticky note for. Once again, I used up all the sticky notes in my house. Wait. I actually have more. Hold on. I forgot. I have bread sticky notes. Okay. So, I'm scooting over. I'm moving Soliloquy over here. Now Marius meets Raphael, a young child who reminds him of Gavroche. Raphael works in a workshop run by the Catman and his crew of associates. I'm going to start creating locations in here. Okay, Marius meets Raphael. Raphael works in the cat workshop. Who's the Catman, you might be wondering? Well, the Catman is none other than Thénardier, which I am representing using the 2018-2019 BBC production. Thénardier apparently did not end up going to the Americas to engage with the slave trade in this universe because something fell through. No. Now he finds stray cats, kills them, skins them, sells the meat to local restaurants claiming that they are rabbit meat, sells the skin to local tanners, and he makes Raphael in the workshop card the cat fur as like a bootleg version of wool to spin into yarn. You know, it's a gotta use every part of the animal, guys. I repeat. Thénardier in this book has a sweatshop for skinning cats with child labor. For what it's worth, Thénardier, knowing that he officially has a death sentence hanging over his head, recall that at the end of Les Mis, he does have a death sentence. It's just that he escaped. He decides not to tell anyone his real name. He got away again. He decides not to tell anyone his real name. He says his name is Tadier. Very creative, in character, etc., etc., etc. Thénardier's crew also includes everyone who runs the workshop and by proxy extent, the folks who run a local, like, tavern, bar, restaurant situation. The clandestine. Where am I going to put this, guys? The Catman crew, the clandestine, and Amadei's crew are all loosely connected by Louis Deslay, who is a shady figure who is Amadei's steward. Everyone here is associated with Louis Deslay in some way, shape, or form. Now, over here on the clandestine, I'm going to put the name Perfect Love. He will become relevant later. Just know that at this moment, he runs the clandestine. There's a lot of bullshit that's going on with all these groups, and I will be honest, it all kind of meshed together in my head because I didn't really care about them. So I won't try and explain all the weird details, but the long story short is Amadei wants Cosette. Amadei is using Clemence in a way to get to Marius in the attempt to get to Cosette. Confusing. Anyways, Thénardier wants control over the clandestine and therefore has it out for the owner, Perfect Love. Yes, everyone involved here has a stupid nickname. This nickname's like the mullet, the wolf. I'm pretty sure the kitten is a Zelma, but unclear. Other people, and also Thénardier, have it out for a guy named Jesus, whose real name is Alexander Tixier. Now, to represent Alexander, I'm going to be using this prayer candle of Nick Jonas, because something very important about him is that he has a striking visual resemblance to Marius. I'm going to put him down here. Anyways, Marius is having ideological battles in his mind between republicanism and being an instant gratification-seeking bourgeois, represented by his relationships with Frédéric and Amadei. Cosette spends more and more time alone and at the church, where she meets a mysterious old man named Verjat. I am representing Verjat with, once again, the BBC version of Javert. You might be wondering, why are you representing this other character with Javert? Verjat is Javert. Now, Verjat has been dedicating his life to bettering the world through small good deeds and caring for the church. He is close to the priest of the church who is known to spend his time wandering the banks of the Seine looking to stop people from committing suicide. Yes, this is how we go from Javert to Verjat. The priest finds Javert and rescues him from drowning. Javert tells him, hey, I no longer want to be Javert. The priest suggests that they switch his clothes with those of a man who actually died in the river, so that when the body is eventually found by someone else, it'll be assumed that it is Javert himself. I mean, he's wearing his clothes, he has his identification, etc., etc. Javert then fashions himself a new identity. Verjat. So Verjat quickly and eagerly befriends Cosette. And it's definitely like a penance thing for him. He almost immediately begins to take on a Jean Valjean role in the story and makes it quickly known that he knew Jean Valjean well, but doesn't tell Cosette who he really is. He makes it seem like he was a friend of Jean Valjean and was inspired by him, and he very quickly becomes a fatherly figure to Cosette. Cosette has become close friends with Frédéric, who has all been friend broken up with by Marius in favor of Amédée. Cosette begins to fear that she has contracted cholera. Remember that there was a cholera epidemic happening in Paris around this time period. It literally killed Lamarck. And Frédéric escorts her to a doctor friend, and surprise, it is not cholera, she is pregnant. Somehow through all of this, Marius and Cosette have been fucking. Anyways, shit's happening. Amédée sees Cosette and Frédéric together and assumes that they're having an affair. He then tells Marius, who assumes that, yeah, he's being cheated on and is pissed off at Frédéric for for cucking him. More stuff happens, and Frédéric and Amédée decide to duel. Both men, Amédée and Frédéric, ask Marius to be their second. And it's a moment where Marius has to choose which ideology to align himself with. Ultimately, he chooses Amédée. And Amédée shoots Frédéric. Marius runs to Frédéric in that moment, and they have a confession time before Frédéric dies, and Marius has a little, oh my god, what have I done? And Frédéric passes away. He's done. No more Frédéric. After the duel, Frédéric has died in his arms. Marius goes to the Père Lachaise cemetery and finds Jean Valjean's grave. He weeps over it and has another, oh my god, what have I done moment, praying that he could become like Jean Valjean. There's a lot of viewing Jean Valjean as a saint-like figure happening in this book from multiple characters. Now, Cosette, having heard about Frédéric, decides to also reflect upon everything at Jean Valjean's grave. And because she sees Marius there already weeping, she's like, okay, fine. I'm going to give you another chance. We'll try all of this over. We're going to try our relationship again. And Marius is like, yippee! At this point in the book, the only thing I wrote in my notes between this moment and the next big arc is, why does Marius personally know Dumas? So yeah, that's what we're working with here. Anyways, the Catman crew, not really Raphael. Raphael at this point is kind of irrelevant. The Catman crew, aided by Louis Desalé, hatch a plan to kill Jesus, aka Alexander, and disguise him as Marius and Marius as Jesus, meaning that they would get rid of Jesus and Marius simultaneously. There's also a plan to send the clandestine guy Perfect Love to prison by getting him to kill his own wife. Long story. It involves them trying to get Jesus and Marius to fight, as a precursor to the main event. Some folks in the Catman crew are collateral damage, including the kitten, who may or may not be a Zelma. It's a lot and also nothing simultaneously. Why? Well, Thénardier, by getting rid of Perfect Love, would somehow get an in on buying the clandestine, plus revenge against Marius and Cosette. And it would get rid of a problem that he has with Jesus. And Louis Desalé kind of loops Amédée and his crew in on it, but not on the details, but under the guise of I don't know, Amédée, Where is he? They might finally get to Cosette this way. They also have some drama going on with clandestine, I don't know. Marius's mistress, Clemence, who, remember, is Amadé's ex in an insanely toxic situationship, is convinced to give Marius some sort of really intense narcotic that basically sends him on an insane trip for multiple days. There's a lot going on in this scene. It basically sends the mistress, Clemence, into psychosis, and she is not relevant for the rest of the book. So at this point, she's done. Marius has signed a form saying that Amadé would be managing his estate for 2 years if he were to die. Totally unsuspicious stuff. Meanwhile, Perfect Love is goaded into killing his wife and is sent to prison. Simultaneously, Jesus is killed. It is all very convoluted. Remember, Jesus looks just like Marius. They swap their clothes and they claim that they duel to death, and Marius, still tripping on narcotics, can't defend himself during his trial. So he essentially wakes up from his trip while on the way to Toulon prison, and he's confused. So at this point, I'm going to attach Jesus' name to Marius, and Nick Jonas. Okay, remember, Alexander's dead. Alexander is dead, but everyone thinks he is Marius Pontmercy, and everyone thinks that this man right here, actual Nick Jonas, is Alexander. I'm gonna do a little bit of rearranging because we have multiple people who are in prison now. I'm gonna keep Marius in the middle because he's pretty central to all of this, but I'm putting in a new sticky note. This is Toulon right here, the clandestine over here. So this is what we're working with right now. Cosette is beside herself with grief over Marius's death. Thankfully, she has Verjat to help her through, but it's still rough. I must also remind you that she is pregnant. Amadé, regretting like everything, who by the way does actually believe that Marius is dead, because he was not in on the body switching part of the plan, he begins to have an "oh my god, what have I done" moment. There's some groveling at Cosette's feet, who hates Amadé even more at this point. Marius has been sentenced to 20 years for murder. Remember, they think he is Alexander, and they think Alexander has killed Marius Pontmercy. Nick Jonas over here is sentenced to 20 years for murder. He is given the number 9430, Jean Valjean's number from his second stint in prison. Marius claims very publicly that he was framed and that he is Marius Pontmercy, and that he doesn't know an Alexander Tixier, but no one really believes him, and they're like, damn dude, you're like kinda crazy. Marius's first friend in prison is a young man named Julien, who is sentenced to 5 years for stealing a loaf of bread. Marius feels very defensive over him, which is exacerbated when he finds out that Julien's chain partner has been sexually assaulting him. Marius kind of immediately starts trying to start shit with Mr. Chain partner. Things happen. Marius makes a name for himself as kind of like an insane, but like truly a man's man kind of guy that other prisoners respect. Julien dies, by the way, but not by Mr. Chain partner's hands. No, he dies in a double suicide with a young nun who thinks that Julien is the reincarnation of her dead lover. Bye, Julien. Marius's inability to protect this young man he adopted as soon as he entered prison works wonders on his mental health. The person that Marius happens to share a chain with in prison is Perfect Love, who recognizes Marius and is very painfully aware that the Alexander next to him is not the Alexander that he knew. Perfect Love and Marius form a friendship and try to survive prison together, with Perfect Love devising ways to ensure that he and Marius earn some sort of preferential treatment and job placement. Once Marius and Perfect Love switch to doing advanced carpentry work, Marius forms some new friendships with other inmates who I have not noted here because they're not all that relevant, to be honest. Amédée, everyone's favorite fail son, has been on an operation to grovel at Cosette's feet, much to the chagrin of Louis Desilets, who really isn't a fan of his charge's change in personality and the fact that he's rapidly burning bridges with folks who could be of benefit to both himself and Louis Desilets. Cosette does not like this man, but forms a sort of weird mutual grieving friendship with him. It's equal parts, you are the dirt beneath my feet, and only you understand the pain that I am going through. Cosette eventually asks for Amédée's assistance in selling the house at Rue Plumet because the memories are too painful for her. Amédée eventually tells Cosette about the form that Marius had signed about the estate, and Cosette is like, bitch, do you think you fucking own me? What are you going to do? And Amédée is like, no, queen, I'm sorry. I even thought about ripping it to shreds. I was so scared to tell you. I won't do anything with this. I just wanted to come clean. And Cosette is like, fucking whatever, man. By the way, I'm pregnant, so you better not fuck me over. And Amédée is like, man, I noticed a little bit, but I was actively ignoring it, like, because it's really scary. So anyways, Amédée suggests that they move. Amédée and Cosette move into a duplex so that they can live close by but live separately. And Cosette is like, sure, fucking whatever, but we'll never fuck. And Amédée is like, I know, queen. Can I be the child's godfather? And Cosette says, yes, permission granted. Cosette has her baby, who she names Jean Pontmercy. For what it's worth, it would have been Fantine if it was a girl. Meanwhile, in prison, Marius is hatching escape plans alongside of all of his new buddies. I didn't give a fuck about most of the details, but there's this one-liner about Marius growing out and shaving his pubic hair for weeks so that he can turn them into fake mustaches and sideburns. This line haunts me. I was so distracted by it that I can barely remember the rest of this section. It involves someone who I vaguely recall was like already ill, maybe. I can't really remember. But this person essentially sacrifices themselves by shoving so many tools up their anus, surprise mouse tools that will help Marius later, that they die from it. And Marius has to like reach into their guts to pull them out. But hey, we managed to smuggle tools out of Toulon. One would argue that I should like remember that part more, but no, the Marius pubic hair got me. And there's a lot of these like really intense gory moments in this book that feel like maybe they're there just for shock value. Like an instance earlier in the book in the cat workshop clandestine blah 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 blah, where someone gets beaten to death in a bag full of severed cat heads. I suppose when you stop focusing on the day-to-day horrors of poverty in early 19th century France, you have to supplement your narrative with some shocking moments to keep the audience, you know, active. Back to Verjat. Verjat, struggling to let go of his police inspector ways, starts having some suspicions about Amédée, and more specifically, Louis Desilets, his steward. Verjat spends a bit of time at the clandestine, which is now known... Are you ready for this, guys? How do I say that? Chamelin? It's a cat thing, okay? It's a cat thing. It's no longer the clandestine. I'm gonna keep calling it the clandestine because I think the new name sucks and it's all Thénardier's fault. Anyways, he starts going to this restaurant, which is now for higher class patrons. He goes daily and he befriends an employee who slowly divulges information to him. It's vaguely homoerotic, as are most things that have to do with Javert. Meanwhile, Thénardier is growing bored of running a respectable restaurant full of wealthy patrons and is itching to do more crime. Jesus' ring, which he always wore, comes back into the picture as a character has it, and someone mentions that they're surprised that Jesus didn't find a way to smuggle it into prison. Verjat's involved somehow, I forget how, and he starts doing his interrogation and inspecting things and decides to exhume the corpse of Jesus, who, once again, everyone thinks is Marius. So technically Verjat exhumes Marius's grave. and notes that the ring finger was chopped off. Now, previously, before burial, Jesus's ring finger had swelled up so much that in order to remove the ring from him, and by that I mean the Catman crew, had to chop the finger off and cover it with gloves so no one would wonder why Marius had Jesus's ring on. Now, Cosette noticed this at the funeral after grabbing the hand, but assumed that the murderer had wanted to steal his wedding ring. Anyways, Verjat's on the case now. He begins researching Louis Désolé's past and odd connections with people outside of Amédée's social circle, aka like Thénardier. Why? Amédée is a marquis, and his title includes the name of an itty-bitty little commune elsewhere in France, which isn't supposed to have a marquis. Amédée, when pressed on this, doesn't seem to know this place at all. And Verjat's preliminary searches imply that Louis Désolé has some connections to the place. He also travels to Toulon under a false identity and manages to question some prison guards who note that prisoner 9430 is missing. Louis Désolé, still insanely pissed off about Amédée's new personality and dedication to Cosette, is like, hey Thénardier, we gotta do something. This shit is boring. And Thénardier is like, oh, obviously we gotta kill him. Duh. Now the book ends on a weird note. Marius has escaped Toulon, but just barely. Verjat goes to the Cosette-Amédée duplex and does not find either person there, but does find a suspicious figure involved with the Thénardier crew absconding with little Jean Pontmercy, and is about to drop the baby off at an orphanage. Now Verjat stops this from happening and takes the baby. We still don't know what Louis Désolé's deal is. And that's it. That's all there is. I think there's a few times that I recorded myself. I had some immediate thoughts while I was reading the book, and I think I recorded them like once or twice, so if I find those files, I'm going to put them here. I'm 117 pages into this book. I want it known that I went into this book wanting to like it. And then I started reading and I had problems on page 1. François, what the fuck is this? I have so many thoughts and opinions about François, and in an attempt to retain Thénardier as a villain. You know, instead of sending him off to a different continent, as Hugo intended in the original book, you know, Thénardier is the closest we get to an actual true villain in this book, or in that book. Not this book, in that book. The logical conclusion of his character is that he gets away with it, and then he's going off to wreak havoc in another place, and he's going to be doing stuff that's significantly worse because there's no limit to where his villainy can go. He is a terrible person. And then François was like, cool potential ending for this character. But what if he didn't do that? What if he didn't go into slave trading? And what I'm going to do instead is, instead of sending him off to go do slave trading, he's going to stay in Paris and he's going to open up a cat skinning sweatshop with child labor. And I go, okay, I understand that you want him to stay in Paris and you want him to be in this book present as the villain. A cat skinning sweatshop with child labor still isn't as bad as slave trading. Hugo picked the worst possible thing for him already. That was the upper limit of villainy. First of all, not having him do that. And then trying to have him do something that I imagine François thought that he was picking something that was pretty comparable. François, do you think this is the same level as slavery? François. Also, we could have had a different villain. It didn't need to be Thénardier again. There's a lot of things about this story that are unnecessary. But that's currently what I have the biggest problem with. I no longer even have an issue with Vergette. Like, Vergette is fine at this point. Narration, in my opinion, is one of the biggest problems with this book. Now, I understand that I was reading a translation, so maybe it works better in French, but in English, the translation, or the narration, is nothing like Les Mis. If you are attempting to write a sequel to a book that simply keeps the story rolling, your narrative is supposed to be attached to the very end of the original book and just keep it trucking, you'd think that you would want to ensure that the narration style matches. But Cérésa does not do this. Les Mis uses an omniscient narrator who has his own opinions. It's, of course, the author himself, Victor Hugo. It is important for the book that it sounds like your long-winded grandfather is telling you about history, politics, and the story itself. The story is interrupted several times over because the narrator feels the need to give you background historical knowledge interspersed with his own opinions on what happened in the past, what continues to happen, and what the future might look like. Yes, the 19 chapters on the Battle of Waterloo are important to Les Mis and the narrative style. Cérésa does not have this style of narration. The narrator is near non-existent. It is a distinctly modern style of writing where the plot is driven by dialogue in 1 to 2 paragraphs at a time, outlining how the characters are feeling, events that have just happened, with the occasional paragraph or two of historical background. The 19th century prose of Les Mis is replaced by concise 21st century sentences that seem to be desperately delivering the plot to you instead of hiding it in the folds of a historical narrative. Unlike in Les Mis, where the narrator tells you about the lives of historical figures before connecting what they've done to what the characters are doing, Cérésa simply inserts the historical figures into the narrative and has them interact with Marius and Cosette. Want to incorporate bits and pieces of Adolphe Thiers' rise to power? Well, let's just have Marius and Cosette, meet him at an opera. Want to bring up characters and newspapers? Marius just happens to be friends with Henri Daumier. Even Victor Hugo himself is a victim of this in the book. Well, Marius and Cosette don't talk to him. He's referenced in a friend of a friend sort of fashion. Once again, why the fuck is Marius friends with Dumas? It's strangely clumsy, made worse by the way that these historical figures crop up once or twice in the story and never stay past a brief introduction, making their appearances feel even more like cheap Easter eggs rather than actual plot points. Instead of the narrator telling you about historical events and ideologies, the characters themselves sit down several times and have discussions about politics. Particularly, this happens often with Cosette and Vergette. Want to reference the guy that Jean Valjean and Javert are both low-key based on? No worries, Cosette and Vergette have been reading his memoirs, and they will be discussing them together. An example of this is on page 128, which says, Frédéric felt a particular antipathy towards Adolphe Thiers. In his opinion, the little opportunist was getting off lightly. The founder of the National had soon found that life as an opposition journalist held no further attractions for him and had lost no time in seizing control of the affairs of state. Politicians were all the same, dedicated humanists before gaining power, eloquent but treacherous when they had it. Thiers' greed derived from his impatience to possess, to enjoy, and to command, often found in those who, starting with nothing, have been the architects of their own fortunes. My video file got super mega corrupted, so I lost the last 10 minutes of my video. So I'm going to very briefly try and summarize the most important points that I made. Regarding my thoughts on the book, I remember I talked about characterization, particularly the characterization of Marius sucks. I think that the Marius at the end of Les Mis would not act like the Marius of this book 2 months post-canon. We've seen Marius grieve before. Sorry, that noise is my cat. We've seen Marius grieve. We've seen Marius deal with PTSD. We've seen Marius deal with so many different things. And I don't think that he would immediately go into a boomer, I hate my wife attitude regarding everything. I think that a Marius who truly idolizes Jean Valjean would go about things more similarly to how he talks about and thinks about his father throughout Les Mis, and he wouldn't be dealing with his PTSD through, like, spending all of Jean Valjean's money and having extramarital sex. Javert isn't Javert. Javert's just Jean Valjean, but the author couldn't find a way to make Jean Valjean live again. Cosette is the only one who seems vaguely similar to how she is in Les Mis, and that's specifically because I think that both Cérésa and Hugo are bad at writing women. I'm not going to comment on that further. Frédéric is interesting, but he's just a Courfeyrac replacement. I think it would have been more fun if Courfeyrac came back. You know, if Javert's gonna live, we might as well make Courfeyrac live again. Granted, I don't think that Courfeyrac would weather survivor's guilt all that well, and something important about Frédéric is that he seems to have no survivor's guilt, so he's a pretty solid character for Marius to interact with. Concluding thoughts. Sorry, my cat's being cute. Concluding thoughts is that the book sucks, but I think it has the right to exist. I think that me, as a very intense... Sorry, my cat just got stuck on my shirt, too. Me, as an insane Les Mis fan, I think I was supposed to be the intended audience for this book, but people who are really intense about Les Mis are not going to like this book, because it betrays the spirit of Les Mis. It missed the point. So therefore, is the audience casual readers? No, because what casual reader is going to pick up 800 plus pages of this book after reading 1,000 pages of Les Mis? I can't get anyone to read Les Mis. Even people who like the musical, I can't convince them to read this fucking book. Therefore, I think that this book was intended to be for really hardcore Les Mis fans. But hardcore Les Mis fans will not appreciate this book. This was slop. That was meant for me. But I don't like Les Mis slop in this specific style. So I don't know. But everyone does deserve slop. I think everyone should have access to their own personal brand of slop. So I'm glad that this book exists and is accessible to read. If you want to read it, go on the Internet Archive. Wow, I wish my video file didn't get corrupted, because I feel like I think I talked about Marius for like 10 fucking minutes, with like 30 seconds being like the book sucked. Don't delete your iMovie files, guys.